In this video, I want to talk about the trigonometric ratios, or we can shorten trigonometric to trig, the trig ratios. So if you hear the word trigonometric or you hear the word trig, they're talking about the same thing. The trig ratios is a way to set up a relationship between the angles in a right triangle and the sides. So I'm going to write that. The trig ratios set up a relationship between the angles in a right triangle and the sides. Now, if I'm looking at a right triangle, most of the time we would just stay away from the right angle with these trig ratios because it can get a little bit confusing, or a little bit like if I'm looking at C, which is the right angle, it can be confusing as to what leg is adjacent to C, because they're both adjacent to C. Both the leg that's 7, that's a length of 7, and the leg that's 5, both of those legs form the angle C. And when we're talking about opposite and adjacent, we're talking about the other two angles, A and B. So as I look at this, if I'm looking at angle B, the opposite side from B, if I go across the triangle, is 5. If I'm at A and I go through the triangle, the opposite side is 7. Now, if I'm at C, I can do opposite side. I can go through the triangle and I get to the hypotenuse. But if I'm at C and we're talking, the opposite and the adjacent sides are always one of the legs. And so as I look at C, they're both legs, and they're both adjacent to C. So we would get a little bit of trouble there if we're talking about this from angle C. Now, let me get to what the trig ratios are. There are 3 trig ratios that we're going to look at in this video. When you take trigonometry, they're going to show you that there's really 6 of them. But for right now, we'll just look at 3 of them. 3 trig ratios. The first one is sine. If I write it out, it's S-I-N-E. Now, when we abbreviate it, we write S-I-N. And I've heard some students, they call it the sin of A. But we really pronounce it the sine, even if it's abbreviated. So S-I-N-E, abbreviated S-I-N. Another trig ratio is going to be cosine. Now we abbreviate cosine, C-O-S. And sometimes students will read cos. Read it cosine, even if you C-O-S, cosine. And then another one is tangent. That's the 3 we're going to look at in this part of the book. Tangent is abbreviated T-A-N. Now, I wouldn't read that tan. Read tangent. And when we're looking at sine, cosine, tangent, there's got to be an angle attached to it. Even as I'm writing sine, cosine, tangent, even just talking about the abbreviations, a part of me on the inside is cringing because I see my students write this all the time, and I cringe when they write it on a test. They write sine, cosine, tangent. You have to attach an angle to that if you're talking about a triangle or something else. And I didn't attach the angle here because I'm simply talking about the abbreviations. But if I'm writing it in reference to this triangle, I would write things like this. So I would write sine, abbreviated SIN, sine A, cosine A, tangent A. And I can use the abbreviations, but I'm pronouncing it the whole word. I could write sine of B. You have to give the angle, or we don't know what you're looking at and pulling from on that triangle. I can write cosine of B and the tangent of B. If I'm looking at a triangle and we're doing the trig ratios, generally we'll stay away from the right angle. I did see on one of the other videos sine of the right angle, cosine of the right angle, tangent of the right angle. And a trig class, they'll address that issue. But this is not trig. Stay away from the right angle if we're doing these trigonometric ratios in this geometry class. So I'm gonna write that. In fact, I'm gonna write stay away from sine. In my picture, C is the right angle. So I'm gonna write sine C, cosine C, tangent C. So I've talked a little bit about the trig ratios. I've talked about their abbreviations. Let's do another video where we talk about what the ratios really are.